Welcome to Storied Ground, a Northwest Ohio history podcast, where we enlist our region's many historical markers as our guides to rediscovering the presence of the past around us in all its wonder, diversity, and complexity. I'm your host, Nick Pavlik. On Township Road 172 in southern Bowling Green, Ohio, near the intersection of the Interstate 75 and Route 6 highways, on 50 acres of scenic grounds adjoining the north branch of the Portage River, sits the Wood County Museum, part of the Wood County Park District. Housed in a stately red brick building and nestled among the variety of tree species comprising the Lyle Fletcher Arboretum, at first glance, the museum appears to be located on what was once a grand private estate belonging to one of Bowling Green's wealthy elite in the 19th century. But as you enter the museum grounds, through the arch of the iconic stone Brandeberry Wall, you're greeted by an Ohio historical marker, erected in the year 2000 and sponsored by the museum, the Ohio Bicentennial Commission, the Longaberger Company, and the Ohio History Connection. This marker tells a very different story about the history of these grounds.
The infirmary, also known as the poorhouse or simply the home, is one of the last county poorhouse sites in Ohio, where nearly all of the original structures still stand. The main building, constructed in 1868, with outbuildings added over the years, served as home for the county's poor, sick, orphaned, elderly, and mentally ill. The infirmary operated as a self-sufficient farm where residents contributed according to their ability. Throughout its 102 years of service, the infirmary had an average population of 80 residents, swelling to over 140 during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The site closed as a poorhouse in 1971, but reopened in 1975 as the Wood County Historical Center and Museum. The Wood County Infirmary was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1979.
Yes, this site had once been a home, but not for one of Bowling Green's wealthy families. A different sort of family once resided here, bound not by blood, but by circumstances of poverty, disability, illness, and old age. This was once the Wood County Infirmary, established in 1869, or, as it was also commonly called during its operation, the Poor Farm, the Poorhouse, or the County Home. This is why the stretch of Township Road 172 that winds around the museum grounds is called County Home Road. Since its opening in 1975, the Wood County Museum has been dedicated to telling the story of Wood County and its people. But in recent years, it has been increasingly focused on preserving and interpreting its own institutional history as the former Wood County Infirmary. And in doing so, it has achieved renown as one of the few museums in the United States where visitors can learn about the history of rural poverty and public charity. In this episode of Storied Ground, we're exploring the history of the Wood County Infirmary. And just a note to listeners, the history of public welfare in America is often laced with terminology that we now know to be inaccurate or outright offensive. We will occasionally be referencing historical sources that include some of this offending language. When we do so, it is solely to illuminate the historical context of the prevailing attitudes and perspectives in 19th and early 20th century America towards serving disadvantaged populations. These views were widely held during the time period, even among the officials responsible for administering public charity. Without further ado, let's meet our expert guide through the history of the Wood County Infirmary.
My name is Holly Kirkendall, and I am the Curator at the Wood County Museum in Bowling Green, Ohio.
Over the past decade, Holly Kirkendall has been at the forefront of the museum's efforts to preserve and interpret the history of the Wood County Infirmary. And in the process, she has also carved out a distinction as an expert on the broader history of public relief and county infirmaries across the state of Ohio.
This really comes from the idea of the British almshouse. Poverty in Victorian England was awful, and if you could not feed yourself, there were no social safety nets, and you'd have to go what was called the workhouse, where you would have to obviously work in order to get room and board, food, the basic necessities of life. And that idea transferred into the colonies and into the Americas, and probably the most famous on the East Coast would be the Boston almshouse. Right, the same idea of people who could not care for themselves would have to go to these places. Ohio becomes a state in 1803. Of course, people are moving west from the Connecticut Reserve, New England area into Ohio. And it was then that the Ohio General Assembly, I believe it would have been around 1816, county commissioners were told that they needed to put money aside to care for their poor. Now, this really impacted the southern part of the state first, because this, of course, was the first part of the state settled due to the Ohio River, transportation, etc. And as the state grew and counties were established, then counties would start doing predominantly what was called outdoor relief. And so that would allow a person to stay in their home. A township trustee, I should explain that, each county is divided up into townships. So for Wood County, there's 19 townships. And in each township, they would have 2 to 3 people, at this time, of course, men, be the trustee. So they would be in charge of managing the money for each township area, building roads or helping with farmers and their needs. So they would go to your house and they would evaluate your situation, and you filled out what was called an application for relief. So if your husband were sick and he could not work, of course, no money would be coming in. So they would pay for a doctor, maybe a nurse, or they would give you food in order to alleviate the suffering because you did not have an income to provide for the family. That was temporary. Relief was always temporary if it was outdoor relief. And in my research, I see it being anywhere from 2 weeks to a month. And the reason for this would be is each township is only going to get so much money based on population, right? And so they'd have to make the money last. And if you needed relief that extended beyond the temporary 2 weeks or a month, you were ordered to come live at the county infirmary. Now, that was not mandatory, but your public charity would be cut off. Generally speaking, in the records that we have here in the Historical Society's collections, a month was really the time period that you had to get back on your feet. Okay. And if you could not, your family would have to come live in this building.
The Wood County Museum maintains the historical archives of the Wood County Infirmary, which contain hundreds of applications for relief submitted to the infirmary by township trustees during the late 19th and early 20th centuries on behalf of county residents in need. These applications detail the vast litany of circumstances that could suddenly befall an ordinary person or family and leave them without means to support themselves.
Weston Township, Wood County, March 5, 1885. Age of applicant, 37 years. Occupation, housewife, married. Number of children, 5. State of nativity, Ohio. Time of residence in township, 5 or 6 years. Cause of present indignance, pregnancy. She will need some attention by a physician until after confinement. Said family are in poor circumstances and unable to employ a physician. To the directors of the Wood County Infirmary, being convinced upon a careful examination according to law that the above statements are correct and that said applicant is a lawful resident of this township and county and is unable to provide for herself and is in actual distress, we do hereby recommend her to you for further examination and relief.
What I see from the records at the Wood County Museum is it's predominantly single men, older men, many of them from Eastern Europe who came to America to work in either the glass factories for farming. They worked in the oil fields, on the railroad. They were day laborers, meaning they would go farm to farm trying to get work, doing odd jobs. Some sort of illness or something that would keep them from working. They did not necessarily have a permanent place to live, so they would come here.
Perrysburg Township, March 7, 1885. Laborer, 74, married but living separate. No dependent children. Old age and inability to perform manual labor.
Perrysburg Township, October 12, 1885. Machinist, 35. single. Injured by railroad train, both his legs being broken.
Ross Township, January 3rd, 1924. Glassworker, 30. Single. Previous habits, dope and drink. Cannot work.
Henry Township, January 24th, 1888. Day laborer, 24. Single. Falling. Fits.
The other types of people that I would see from our records, single women or women with children whose husbands either, as it was put on the applications, ran away, they were alcoholics, they were in jail, they were abusive. There was no safety net for women, especially in the 19th century, and especially if they had children and no way to feed themselves, they would come here as well.
Henry Township, April 1st, 1911. Housewife, 32, married, 2 children, husband in jail, no support for family.
Milton Township, January 14th, 1907. Housekeeper, 48 years. Married, 5 children, deserted by her husband.
By and large, a lot of elderly women as well, whose husbands died. Children perhaps could not take care of their mother, and so they would come here, or they didn't have any family to speak of, and so they would come and live here.
Freedom Township, January 12th, 1904. Housekeeper, 68, widow. No children, unable to self-support. Center Township, December 6th, 1922. Housekeeper, 84. Single, inability to care for self, lack of a home, and want of means for self-support and advancing age.
The museum's archives also contain tape recordings and transcripts from oral history interviews the museum conducted in the 1980s with former Wood County Infirmary employees to document what everyday life at the infirmary had been like. One of the people interviewed for the project was Leonora Smith Fryer. Born in 1912, Fryer grew up in a farmhouse adjacent to the infirmary and worked there primarily as a cook from the late 1920s to the 1940s. Fryer also recalled particular stories of the circumstances that led Wood County residents to seek relief at the infirmary, one of which was the rampant unemployment of the Great Depression.
Now, you see, in 29 was a depression. Well, then we had like 40 from Rossford. Now, they came over here from usually Hungary or Austria, and they left their families over there. And they worked in Rossford, but they sent all their earnings over to support their families. So when the Depression came, they were laid off and they had nothing in reserve to live on. They were the ones that always worked in the garden. They had the most beautiful flowers. Some of them could speak English, but they just wound up out there because they had no place.
Once admitted to the infirmary, residents' length of stay varied widely depending on the circumstances that brought them there.
You could stay a day, you could stay the duration of your life. It just depended on your necessity. Very specific to the circumstances, and that's the best part about being able to research the residents, is knowing what those circumstances were. Our first set of residents, actually, there is one woman, her name was Catherine. She did live here, I believe, about 30 years. She moved in 1869 and died in 1902. She was from what we understand, a Civil War widow. We have lots of information on people who, came a couple of days and a family member would take them in, or they would move across the country, or they would be sent back to their county of origin.
In fact, the people that were there, they had a much better home than if they'd lived on the outside. Now, one time, Mr. Brandenburry went over to Signet, and he got a whole family, father and mother, and there were 3 children, and I know it was in the winter time, and he said he had to ride with the windows open, and they had a shed out the back. I don't think that shed's there anymore. If anybody came in, they were taken to this shed and given a bath. Their clothes were burned, and I know Mr. Crusoe was kind of mad. He said he almost had to use a hoe to clean them. Now, they only stayed there like maybe 2 nights, and they got into a place in Bowling Green, or they went someplace, but they were about to freeze to death in this shack they lived in Signet.
We have record of some people living here upwards of 50 years, and so it really just depended on your situation.
The longer residents stayed at the infirmary, the more likely it was that they were unable to care for themselves independently due to illness or disability. Leonora Smith Fryer remembered one particularly tragic case of a resident who had suffered a traumatic brain injury.
Now, we had one there that was a very sad case. Now, she was a neighbor lady, and she was just as sane as you or I. And her husband, he had one of those old Model T Fords, and he hit the cement bridge embankment just up beyond where I lived, and she flew out, and her head hit the cement, and she became insane from that day on. One night, there was such a ruckus up there, Mrs. Brandenbury said, "Go up and see what's going on." Well, Ruth, that was the lady's name, didn't want to go to bed, and so I politely said to her, I said, "It's time to go to bed." And she growled at me like a wild animal. I said, "All right," I said. "When you get ready, then you go." And I'd stay in the hall, then maybe 10 or 15 minutes while she'd shuffle off to her bedroom. She couldn't pick up her feet, but her brain was so damaged. You see, back in those days, what was your medical treatment?
The story of Ruth highlights the stark reality of the limitations of public welfare in rural America in the 19th and 20th centuries. It wasn't just people experiencing poverty that came to live at county infirmaries. Before the emergence of more sophisticated and specialized social welfare institutions, people were often sent to live in infirmaries if they suffered from age-related or chronic illnesses, mental illnesses, or if they had a physical or intellectual disability that made it difficult for them to function outside an institutional setting.
Plain Township, February 24th, 1885. Female, 36, no occupation. Single, no children. Sickness and imbecility.
Henry Township, January 3rd, 1888. 77, unknown, appears partially insane.
Bloom Township, March 22nd, 1906. Oil driller, 56, married, no children, blind and paralyzed.
Center Township, May 24th, 1915. Female, 50, married but husband lives in Fremont. She is paralyzed and can't talk.
With the modern advances we enjoy today in medical, rehabilitative, and mental health care, it's likely that many of these residents could have been successfully treated for their conditions. But at the time, specialized health care hadn't yet evolved to the point where effective treatments were available for them.
There was what was called the BG Community Hospital, which was downtown, or they would have doctors come in and tend to people. But if you could not afford medical care in a standard hospital, this is the place that you came. And obviously in the mid to late 19th century, the medical care is not what it is in modern times. And so pretty much there wasn't a whole lot that could be done for you other than make you comfortable.
With inadequate or inaccessible health care, and with nowhere else for residents to go, death was a routine presence at the Wood County Infirmary. Several long-term residents eventually died at the infirmary and were laid to rest in its cemetery.
Some people, they would come and they'd stay and they'd leave simply because they died in this building. Then either you were buried in our cemetery here if you could not afford burial. The county commissioners paid for burial at a different cemetery if you had a family plot, or the family would take the body and bury you at their cost.
In her oral history, Leonora Smith Fryer recalled the death of a resident she had come to know.
Well, now, this lady that was deaf and could not hear or speak. Now, she was mentally all right, but you couldn't converse with her, and she was just as neat as could be, and she would always do the dishes for me or wipe them, and then I would always give her a plate of food. And anyway, to my knowledge, she was the only one that died of cancer while I was there. And well, it's the same thing there. Her mother and no relative to take her, and she was a very nice lady, and I know we was standing in front of the kitchen window. It was on Sunday, and of course they, would bury him right away. they would go to town and get these caskets. Now, sometimes they would get a regular casket. It was either damaged in shipping, and usually it had a soiled lining, and it was the one that was on display. I know the one that they buried, this lady that was deaf. She was the only one they showed. Now, I remember they had her up in the sitting room to let the other ladies see her. They would never have any funeral or anything, and if they had no known relatives. And this was such a cold, windy day, and we was looking out our kitchen window, which we had a full view of it. And, they put the casket on the pickup truck that they had then, and they quick put the casket in the ground.
Given the circumstances that brought people to the infirmary, it might come as no surprise that the Wood County Infirmary, like all county infirmaries in Ohio, was the subject of intense public stigma in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Infirmary residents were typically referred to as inmates. Poorly developed medical knowledge, along with the deeply entrenched social attitudes of the time, often resulted in residents with mental illness or disability being described with terms like imbecilic, lunatics, insane, crazy, or dangerous. These views were often propagated in local newspaper coverage of the infirmary.
Wood County Sentinel, January 21st, 1869. The County Infirmary. We were out to visit this institution last week, not with a view of taking quarters there. Not yet. The building is finished and some of the rooms are already being gotten ready for the inmates. The farm and building are under the efficient management of Mr. T.C. Reed, who is fast getting things in shape. There are 9 persons now in Perrysburg who are to be transferred to this institution at once. The most of them are dangerous and require confinement in cells. The others are merely indigent and enfeebled.
Even Thomas C. Reed, the infirmary's first superintendent, wrote the following in a report on the infirmary to the Sentinel, dated April 22, 1869. The health of the inmates is very good. The crazy people are getting along finely. We let them out in the open air to exercise, and it is making a marked improvement of them. We have at present 30 inmates and have discharged 6 during the last quarter. Until the turn of the 20th century, those sent to the Wood County Infirmary for reasons of mental illness were housed in a separate building called the Lunatic Asylum, which still stands on the Wood County Museum grounds today.
So the Lunatic Asylum, if you were considered mentally ill in the 19th century, you did not go to what we would know as talking therapy today, right? You don't have a therapist in your Rolodex or in your phone in the 19th century. You would go before a judge, and they would have a doctor on staff for the courthouse, and they would go by what people would say, how you were acting, and they would sentence you whether or not you should be in a state-run mental facility. Until they could find a bed for you, they would send you to the poorhouse. The idea is that you come here, you'd stay, and then they could get you. At first, it was the Newburgh Asylum, which I think the Newburgh Asylum is what they call the Cleveland State Hospital, until they built the Toledo Mental Hospital. But just like today, getting a bed in a mental hospital in the 19th century is, it's hard. And so they just needed a holding place. Now, if you come visit the site, you'll see that there's bars on the windows, and that is not because we were doing treatments or trying to treat people poorly. I have read in several of the first-hand primary resources that they were doing this to keep people safe from themselves. They didn't want people to hurt themselves, and so they had to bar the windows so people didn't try to get out or maybe try to hurt themselves. But the laws changed. By 1900, they were sending people deemed by the courts mentally ill directly to mental hospitals. I do see in the records sometimes in the 30s and 40s, if an elderly person comes here, you'll see written that Frank Wright sent to Toledo State Mental Hospital. The person probably had dementia or Alzheimer's, but they didn't know what that was back then. And if they were acting to a point where they could not be controlled, they would send them there. I, as curator, though, I insisted we still call it the Lunatic Asylum. And I explained it on the panel outside of the building because While in the 21st century we realize how offensive the language is, it's very important to understand the origins, because I think when there is language that we see as offensive in the modern times, you have to understand how it got to be that way. You know, why did we start using those terms, and what happened to make us question whether or not that's a great idea of how we're referring to people with disabilities. And so I explained, it's the first paragraph on our sign on the building that explains why we still call it the lunatic asylum. I do read in Frank Brandybury's journals, though, that they call it the crazy house. They refer to it as the crazy house in the 30s and 40s, which is not uncommon, right? You have to take things in the historical context. And so I think a level of empathy comes from understanding the why.
Like mental illness or disability, poverty and homelessness were also subject to intense stigma in purportedly respectable society, which often associated poverty with laziness, depravity, or sinful or criminal behavior. These disparaging social attitudes toward poverty are also evident in the historical archives of the Wood County Infirmary.
Did you find any evidence in your research of anybody who could not afford to continue living on their own, but also did not want to come to the county infirmary?
Absolutely, because the stigma of living in a poorhouse was so negative. Because, you know, we're living in a society that's obviously very religiously driven, a sense of pride. That is something that popular culture, I like to say, especially the poem written by Will Carleton, I believe he wrote that in 1872, called Over the Hill to the Poorhouse, which is extremely lengthy, talking about an old woman whose family sends her to the poorhouse rather than care for her. And obviously that poem has negative undertones, and I don't think people want to be associated with that.
Over the Hill to the Poorhouse is a vivid distillation of the stigma by which county infirmaries were often depicted in 19th century American popular culture. In the first several stanzas, the elderly narrator expresses her disbelief at the once unimaginable circumstances that have befallen her and suddenly made her a member of the pauper class.
Over the hill to the poorhouse, I'm trudging my weary way. I, a woman of 70, and only a trifle gray. I who am smart and chipper for all the years I've told, as many another woman that's only half as old. Over the hill to the poorhouse, I can't quite make it clear. Over the hill to the poorhouse, it seems so horrid queer. Many a step I've taken, a toilin' to and fro, but this is a sort of journey I never thought to go. What is the use of heaping on me a pauper's shame? Am I lazy or crazy? Am I blind or lame? True, I'm not so supple, nor yet so awful stout, but charity ain't no favor if one can live without. I am ready and willing and anxious any day to work for a decent living and pay my honest way, for I can earn my victuals, and more too, I'll be bound, if anybody is willing to only have me round. Once I was young and handsome, I was upon my soul. Once my cheeks was roses, my eyes was black as coal. And I can't remember in them days of hearing people say, for any kind of reason, that I was in their way. 'Tain't no use of boasting or talking over free, but many a house and home was open then to me. Many a handsome offer I had from likely men, and nobody ever hinted that I was a burden then. And when to John I was married, sure he was good and smart, but he and all the neighbors would own I done my part, for life was all before me and I was young and strong, and I worked my best and smartest in trying to get along.
By the poem's conclusion, the narrator, having been turned away by all her children and sent to the poorhouse by her son Charlie, is left with feelings of resignation, bitterness, and grief, and has no choice but to leave her familiar world behind and take up residence at the infirmary.
So they have shirked and slighted me and shifted me about. So they have well nigh soured me and wore my old heart out. But still I've borne up pretty well and wasn't much put down, till Charlie went to the poor master and put me on the town. Over the hill to the poorhouse, my children dear, goodbye. Many a night I've watched you when only God was nigh, and God'll judge between us, and I will always pray that you shall never suffer the half that I do today.
It's little wonder, then, that some infirmary residents internalized the stigma toward county infirmaries and felt a great sense of shame over the conditions that drove them to seek public charity. In her oral history, Leonora Smith Fryer recalled the case of one such resident at the Wood County Infirmary, and even unknowingly expressed a bit of this stigma herself.
And I know one Saturday night, and I knew this man. He was a neighbor man. Now he was, well, those old people around here, like my folks and the neighbors and everything, if you wound up in the county home, they allowed for the mentally and physically disabled. But if you were alcoholic, or if you were just plain lazy and you went for broke, which this man did, it was just a real sin, just a big sin if you'd go out and murder somebody. To die in the poorhouse. Oh boy, nobody wanted to go there. And well, anyway, Mr. Watson came over, and just Al and I was there alone, and he said, well, Mr. Crom, that was his name, was sick, and he'd had a heart condition, and so then it was my job. I had the keys to where the medicine was locked up, and so then Al said to me, well, go get him some heart medicine. Well, he was sitting on the bottom of the stairs, but he was already gone, and Mr. Watson come out, and I said, well, I felt his pulse, and he was slumped over. And so then I went back up to the office, and I said to Mr. Farmer, well, call the undertaker. Now, I mean, he was just, unfortunately, he was a farmer, and he just went broke, and I don't know if he could take care of himself or not. He was sort of a semi-invalid then, and he didn't like it there either. He knew it was against the society outside, the neighbors, thumbs down. Oh boy, that was terrible. If you had to die in the poorhouse, forget it.
But overall, there was a vast difference between the public perception and stigma surrounding public charity at the Wood County Infirmary and the actual reality of how it was provided.
Yeah, there were people who didn't want to come here. Some of those people who at first resisted it eventually did have to come here, but most people took advantage of coming here and being able to get back on their feet again and leave. Poverty is almost always a matter of circumstance. Rarely do you find somebody trying to take advantage of the system, or they're just generally lazy or not a good person. You'll come to find that in most cases, and specifically for the state of Ohio, and even more specifically in Wood County, people who needed public charity relief were actually treated very well, and this was a place that a lot of people called home.
In fact, most people who sought relief at the infirmary for reasons of financial hardship resided there for only a brief period. For this reason, there is very little documentation of their time at the infirmary. We know comparatively much more about the infirmary's permanent residents, typically older people and people with physical and intellectual disabilities. And it is through their stories that we can glimpse beyond the stigma into the actual nature of everyday life at the infirmary.
The men were allowed to smoke, and they would have to come in and all, and I would give them 2 matches. They'd either come in the front door and go in the office where Mr. Farmer was, or they'd come in the back door. Well, this was his name was Bill Long, and he took care of the chickens, and my mother used to worry about it when I would first start going to school at 6 years old. She was always afraid these old men would grab me, and, he just stood there, and I said, Bill, you've got your matches, now get moving. You had to let them know who was giving the orders around here. And he said, oh boy, he says, you're the best one around here yet. Other people said they couldn't see how I worked there, but being there off and on from the time I could remember, you knew them all.
And then there was infirmary resident Bert Gifford.
Well, Bert is probably our most recognizable person who lived in this building. And actually, I've been trying to do a lot of research for him because my coworker Alyssa and I are going to create a children's activity called A Day in the Life of Bert, where people can go around and learn about what it was like for Bert to live here based on what we know, and that this was his home. So Bert Gifford, he did not come to live here till 1918. Now I'd have to look up his exact birth date, but he was older. He was in his 30s, so he had a family. He was from Wayne, which was Prairie Depot when he was born. His father was quite a bit older, and he was born of the second wife. So he had a brother and a sister. I think he had one brother and one sister. Maybe he had two brothers and a sister, but one of the brothers, I think that he died. The father died, and so Bert lived with his mother, and then his brother, I believe, fell out of a hayloft and broke his back, and so he was not able to care for the family, so of course he wouldn't have been able to care for Bert. The sister was married, but she ends up dying, so she dies, brother dies, mom dies. And in Frank Brandeberry's journal in 1918, it writes, going to Wayne to pick up Bert Gifford. And I am not entirely sure. So I don't know if Bert could read. I don't know if he could write. I don't know what level his disability was. He clearly had a developmental disability with his arm, intellectual disability, but he was, from what I've read, he was beloved by the people who lived here. He was good-natured, very religious, which makes sense for the time period. He liked to sing. He liked Count Your Many Blessings. That's what he liked to sing. He had a red wagon. We have pictures of him with his red wagon. So apparently he was a jokester, and he liked to make people laugh. When you walk through the museum and you see his photos, especially if you're a child, you might be scared. I get a lot of people telling me they came here in the 40s and 50s as Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts, and they would sing to the people, and it scared them. And as a child, I could understand people being afraid, right? I don't want people to be afraid when they look at those pictures. I am sure that Bert was a kind and pleasant person. He ends up being here just up until they closed this building and they moved across the street. So he would have died in this building. He is buried in Wayne, so he lived here from 1918 till 1967. So this definitely was his home, and we are doing our best actually to learn as absolute much about him as we can. We have some research trips planned out to Wayne to go to the cemetery. I've done a bunch of research on ancestry, and I have combed through newspapers and read everything we have on him and looking at his family and just trying to figure out who are these people so that we can give a very complete story for when people come here.
Kirkendall's research suggests that, far from being the sort of austere and dismal institution depicted in popular culture, the Wood County Infirmary really functioned more like a family home. The quality of care provided to the residents was undoubtedly primitive compared to our modern standards, but at the infirmary, they found a sense of affinity and belonging that had been denied them in the outside world.
Most of these, it's predominantly men. Some women, they have families, but families that did not know or did not have the resources to care for them. And the specialized care for people with disabilities did not exist. And so they're fortunate that they weren't necessarily out on the street. They may not have had the right care or maybe the ability to learn to read and write, which now we know that's not always an impossibility. But at least that the people who were here accepted them into their family. People didn't have a lot when they came here, but they did have each other. At least they weren't alone.
Residents also enjoyed a feeling of security and stability provided by the infirmary's two longest-serving superintendents and matrons, Edwin and Charlotte Farmer and Frank and Lottie Brandeberry, who were looked to as parental figures by both residents and staff.
One of the things that we're lucky about is in our ledger books you could see we've had two main superintendents here. So the building, of course, was opened in 1869, and a man named Thomas Reed was the superintendent. He was the first one until about 1872, 1874. Then they hired a man named E.M. Schreiber, and he was not caring for the place properly, so the county commissioners fired him, and Edwin Farmer took over. So he is one of the first that is really notable. He was born in Wantage, England, and I truly believe that his level of compassion stems from where he is from, because the English tend to be about 20 years more advanced than the Americans when it comes to social laws. His father was a butcher. He saw a lot of how people in Victorian England were living. He actually came over to the Americas with his brother. They initially were going to go work on an oil rig in Louisiana, and for whatever reason, they ended up in Millbury, Ohio. I believe they worked at a lumber yard, and we're not entirely sure, but obviously the commissioners would have advertised for the job, and he applied and got this job. He was on the Ohio State Board of Charities board and president of the board for 23 years. He was the longest serving member of that board before when he died in 1904. And so I think that really benefited the people of Wood County because how well the residents were being treated, and he was really taking it to heart to humanize the people living here and not making them feel bad because they fell on hard times or they couldn't afford to care for themselves.
Wood County Sentinel, December 4, 1902. The reappointment of Edwin Farmer, superintendent of the county infirmary, by the directors of that institution at their meeting Tuesday, will receive the approval of the taxpayers and citizens generally of Wood County. Mr. Farmer has been in charge of the county infirmary for a quarter of a century, having first assumed its superintendency January 1, 1877, and he is, in point of continuous service, the oldest infirmary superintendent in the state. During the time he has been in charge of the infirmary, by his careful, businesslike, and conscientious management, it has been brought to a standard of excellence not surpassed by any similar institution in Ohio.
He dies in 1904 suddenly from the flu. His son-in-law, Frank Brandeberry, whose story is actually pretty interesting too, Frank was born in Hancock County, right over the line by Bairdstown, and his family, or his father, Isaac Brandeberry, is one of a slew of Brandeberries from southern Wood County, but Isaac and Matilda only had Frank, and Matilda, who's Frank's mother, died when he was 9, and Isaac died when Frank was 17. And I have seen the will, and I'm not entirely sure why the farm didn't go to Frank. It went to his uncles. And so we think that he was a hired hand here, and in 1902 he married the boss's daughter, Lottie. And when Edwin Farmer dies in 1904, his son-in-law Frank and Lottie took over. Now when they got married, they planned on leaving. They planned on getting a farm and leaving because Lottie's older brother Warren left. He went to Lima. He farmed. He never really lived at the site other than when he was growing up. But they ended up staying here until 1949. So, things are a little bit different. But in the record, we see where both Edwin and Frank were very compassionate. Now, the specialized care and services for people did not exist. But if somebody really needed to go to the state-run mental facility, the guys made sure the person got there, and they would write it in the ledger book. Or sometimes you would see a little note written talking about how this is a very sad case. She desperately does need help. We need to get her to the infirmary as soon as possible. So you definitely could tell that these men were compassionate. We see in the newspaper that Edwin Farmer would give the residents money to go to the fair every year, and that was a tradition that continued after his death.
The Daily Sentinel, September 27, 1904. This week will be a gala one in the lives of the inmates of the county infirmary, for each and every one who is able will go to the county fair. There they are treated as courteously by the officials as anyone with pockets full of money. No admission is asked from the county charges, and they are free to enjoy anything to be found on the fair ground. Each day the men are privileged to come to the city and attend the fair. The women at the county infirmary are each given 1 day's outing and are driven to and from the city by an attendant. They leave right after an early dinner and return home after the doings at the fairgrounds are over. The custom was started by the late Edwin Farmer, for so many years superintendent of the infirmary, and was only one of many little things done by him to help make the lives of the county charges more pleasant.
Frank would take people in his car into town because you weren't sentenced here. It wasn't like a jail. You could go to town, and the superintendent and matron would take the residents. The one story that I have been told by a relative is that obviously Edwin and Charlotte Farmer had family in England, and they wrote to their family and said, will you please send enough china so that everybody in the county home can eat on nice china together. And I do have a photo of it. My dear friend, who is the third great granddaughter of Edwin Farmer, was able to locate some from a relative. So we know what the china looks like, but the family lore is when everybody died, they threw away buckets full of this china, not knowing that this was all infirmary stuff, that all of the residents ate on this beautiful stoneware together. It's blue and it's got a gold leaf border, blue floral. I think it's Johnston ironstone china. But that is not something in popular culture you hear of people who run a poorhouse that want to do. They want everybody to feel like a family, and they all ate on this nice dinnerware together. So yes, we have little snippets of where we see that there is a lot of compassionate care for the people who lived in this building.
What about the two matrons of the site that had the longest tenure here, Charlotte Farmer and Lottie Farmer, then Lottie Brandeberry?
Yes.
Do we know as much about them as we do their husbands?
I don't know as much about Charlotte because obviously, women tend to work in the background, but we do know. So again, family lore. So the Farmer family had, I believe, 5 children. So Alfred, Warren, Lottie, Rose, and they had a little boy named Joseph who died, I believe, at 5 months old. Don't quote me on that, but I know he was a baby when he died. And Alfred, who was the oldest, he actually was born in England. He became deputy sheriff. He had an issue with a nervous system issue. I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if it was sciatica or something. That he ended up coming back after he was deputy sheriff and he lived here. But before, when he was young, he went between living in town and living here. A woman actually named Amy Carter came to live here. Her mother passed away. Her father ends up remarrying, and for whatever reason, Amy comes to live here. And Amy and Alfred get married, and they live here a vast majority of their life too. But we were been told that Amy had a problem, whether she had scoliosis or something wrong with her, and she could not walk, that Charlotte's the one who helped her learn how to walk. So this again is family folklore that I have been told, so I might be telling the story incorrectly. I do have the person who would tell the story correct if people are hot to get the facts. But I have been told that she was very compassionate in that regard. I would just think if you raise your family in the poorhouse and your daughter makes a decision to live her entire life, and the other daughter, Rose, ended up marrying a man, and she lived in Canada for a while, and she lived in Dearborn, Michigan, but she had children, and she would send the kids here in the summertime. And Amy and Alfred had 2 daughters and a son, and when the daughters got married and had kids, they would send their kids to come here in the summers. So it couldn't have been that bad if family was sending family to come live at the infirmary in the 20s, 30s, 40s. So I would think that the matronly influence, the care, the mothering, we do have reports from many people who worked here, who lived here, that Lottie Brandeberry was referred to as Ma. Alice and Charlie Cruza named their children after Frank and Lottie because they admired them so much. And so, yes, we really feel that the matrons were just as influential as the superintendents on the people who lived here.
Mrs. Brandeberry, I think she was the most marvelous person I ever knew. She had the most wonderful sense of humor. Mrs. Brandeberry's niece and nephew would visit in the summertime, and we'd go in there, and they were just like second parents to us. We just grew up with them.
So I really feel like it probably was a family atmosphere here.
In her oral history, Leonora Smith Fryer shares several memories that also suggest that life at the infirmary often took on the character of a large, boisterous family environment. There were mealtimes.
Let's see. They'd always have breakfast at 6 o'clock. And old Art, he would always call, "Trays!" George had to carry trays because most of the women didn't come down the stairs. They weren't able to walk enough. And then most of the men came in the dining room, but there were a few that couldn't, very, very few. Main meal was at noon, and then they'd go back out in the yard in the afternoon. They'd eat 5 at night, and then they'd usually go out until it started getting dark. Nobody had to tell them to get in or anything. They were actually, they were like a bunch of little children.
There were holiday celebrations.
The king's daughters used to come out at Christmas time and in the summer. They'd give a program. Oh, did those people look forward to that, because that was the only time they would get ice cream and cupcakes. And we'd always go, my sister and I would always go over. They'd have a good program. They'd bring out, like Girl Scouts or somebody to, singing like that. And then at Christmas time, they would always bring a present out for each one. The men would either get a tie or socks, and the woman would get in such a fight if one of them got a handkerchief and the other one got an apron. So finally, Mrs. Brandeberry had to tell the king's daughters to bring the same things. They were just like kids. And now on Thanksgiving, Mrs. Brandeberry said she and Alice would bake pumpkin pies, and they would clean all those chickens. On Thanksgiving and Christmas, they would get chicken and pie. I know she baked pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving, and then at Christmas time, they would buy this mince meat off the Heinz truck that came in, and then on the 4th of July was another. Oh, those people so looked forward to the holidays.
There were family squabbles when the parental authorities were away.
Mr. and Mrs. Brandeberry would always go to Bowling Green on Saturday night. That's when she would buy her supplies and she would buy the groceries. Well, then I would stay there on Saturday night with Mr. Farmer, but he was semi-paralyzed, and then these women would see that car go out the driveway. Whoopee! Upstairs I had to go. They were in a big fight.
And there were chores. Sometimes interrupted by more family squabbles.
Now, we had the 2 Huber brothers. John took care of the pigs, and George, my dad said to me one day, he said, "I could hear you call George clear over to our place." I called him 365 days of the year. He had no memory at all. And he had to empty the wastebaskets, and I had to call him. And he'd come in the kitchen, sit down. "Well, Leonora, what do you want?" I said, "George, you know what you're supposed to do?" That went on every week, but now John, well, he knew more, but he was... One day I called George to empty the mop bucket, and I always hung the mop out there on the back porch, and John would be sitting on the steps, and he didn't want George to go by. They got in a squabble like kids, but they were adults, and I said, "John," I said, "get off that step and leave George down with the mop bucket." And they sort of got in a rustle, and I picked up the wet mop, and I said, "John, you want this?" And he took off running, didn't look where he was going, and he run smack into Mr. Brandeberry. And he said, "John, what's the matter?" And he said, "I was after him with the mop." And then I told Mr. Brandeberry, I said, they were fighting.
Residents were expected to contribute to the daily labor of maintaining the infirmary building and grounds to the extent that they were able.
People did work based on their ability. We have record of that. Even if you had some form of disability or elderly, people did try to contribute the best that they could. Obviously, the domesticated work was split by gender: men in the fields, women in the house.
Brothers George and John Huber both had intellectual disabilities, but were fully capable and able-bodied, and could often be seen working on the infirmary grounds. In fact, the Huber brothers helped Superintendent Frank Brandeberry build the now iconic arched stone wall surrounding the infirmary grounds, which today is one of the defining architectural features at the Wood County Museum.
Frank Brandeberry built the wall. He started that wall in 1919 and finished it in 1925. And Frank he's so proud of the wall that he built. And so a couple of the gentlemen, they were brothers, George and John Huber. It is noted that John helped him wash all the rocks and George helped placing the rocks. But it was really Frank who spearheaded the whole project to put it. We spent an immense amount of money keeping that wall from falling down. We're very proud of that. It's a very unique feature to our site.
Labor on the part of infirmary residents was an expectation built into the original conception of the infirmary as a self-sustaining communal poor farm.
This was a 200-acre working farm. All the poorhouses in the state of Ohio were working farms. You'd come here, you would contribute. The farm is supposed to be self-sustaining.
However,
over time, it was realized that this looked good on paper, but this was not something that was sustainable because it was predominantly the elderly and people with mental and physical disability that ended up living in poorhouses. The superintendent would have to hire help to work in the farm fields to produce the needed crops to sell for sustainability and to feed the residents.
in addition to hired hands, neighboring farmers would also regularly come to the infirmary to help out with the daily farm labor and other necessary operations. One of those neighbors was Leonora Smith Fryer's father, Bill Smith.
Well, then in the winter, my father and the neighbor man would all go over there in the wintertime and cut ice. And then the neighbors would help haul coal from Bowling Green. And then the neighbors would help make the ice, like Mr. Phillips, my uncle, my father, and whoever lived around there. Then, of course, they would always thresh. They would haul all the grain in the barns, and then, same way my father had threshing, and the neighbors would all get together. You'd always have like a dozen men. All the neighbors helped each other because, you know what an old threshing machine is like. You had a binder that cut the wheat and tied it in bundles, and they always hauled it all in the barn, and then it'd be about October before they would thresh it. Now, most of the grain would all go to feed the chickens and the cows and the sheep and the pigs. They butchered pigs mostly. They never butchered sheep, they just sold the wool off of them.
As a cook at the infirmary, Fryer also recalled several details about how the infirmary sourced its food. Most of it was grown on the infirmary farm, while other foods were sourced locally from Bowling Green, with occasional exceptions for foods that, at the time, would have seemed utterly exotic.
See, they was more or less self-supporting. Now, Mr. Brandeberry would go to Bowling Green every day and get bread. And then they did plant a whole field of corn, and they would dry corn. Sometimes they would have beets, you had to harvest them or they would get too big. And then the Heinz truck would bring out the gallon cans of canned beans, or soup. And I think they got sugar on their oatmeal. They always made mashed potatoes. Few things that were purchased outside of flour, bread, and sugar. Then one year in the wintertime, the government surplus, they must have had so many grapefruit. They were shipped in from Texas, and they were great big, they were just marvelous tasting. They'd bring in great big bags full. So it was my task to squeeze all those grapefruits out and make pitchers of juice, and they would get that for breakfast. And they also would get tomato juice. The meals weren't, fantastic, but always plenty. Nobody starved.
Life continued on much in this way at the Wood County Infirmary throughout the first half of the 20th century, even while public welfare more broadly was radically transforming across much of the state of Ohio. By 1900, Ohio's public welfare system had evolved to include more specialized institutions to provide for the specific needs of certain disadvantaged populations. Institutions such as county hospitals, state psychiatric hospitals, schools for the deaf and blind, and orphanages and children's homes, along with professionalized social work. This marked the beginning of the transition of Ohio's county infirmaries into modern-day nursing homes. But the modernization of public welfare was much slower to take root in Ohio's predominantly rural counties. In Wood County, the infirmary remained the only place of refuge for many disadvantaged county residents until well into the latter 20th century.
As time goes on and we get in from the 19th to the 20th century, there comes a realization, okay, all of the county homes have been built. Several of them have burned down several times. We're realizing that the people who live in our buildings cannot manage the farmland. They can't get up and down these stairs. Okay, counties, we want you to take all that money you spent and tear down your county home and build a nursing home. The equivalent of a nursing home, a one-story unit that has hospital wings in it that can really care for the elderly patients, because there was a realization that, hey, you know what, we can't throw all of these people into a living situation with a husband and wife team with no medical training and expect to care for it. So there's this idea, okay, yes, they're poor, but why are they poor? Oh, they're poor because he's old and he can't go out and farm anymore. And his sons have all moved away for different career opportunities. And obviously, women still can't work, right? So what are we going to do? Or mom has arthritis and none of us can take care of her because I've got 10 kids and my husband's gone all the time and we don't have the space to manage mom. So she has to go live at the poorhouse. And so there was a lot of debate that, okay, poorhouses are really not meant for anybody but the elderly. We're not entirely sure what we're going to do with people who have physical and developmental disabilities. Children absolutely have to go to an orphanage, and everybody else has to go to state-run facilities. And that's when you really start to see social work is born in the 1920s, where they're now looking at the person and not just the overall categorization of poverty. Poverty now is, okay, asking the question, why are you poor? And how can we help you without you having to live in institutional care? And if you need to live in institutional care, do we have you in the right one? So the evolution took time, but I think it was a really necessary thing, because this was not something that, you know, with the country honestly being so new, this is not something that they had to deal with. The one thing that I have seen, though, if you live in a rural community, the transition is a lot slower. Wood County's obviously is a lot slower. When the state came to inspect, like 1943, they wrote about how Lottie's a big woman. She can't get around very well. Both of them are quite elderly. They've lived here their whole lives. Their intention is good, but they cannot do it anymore. They've got to start looking for replacements, and they've indicated they want to retire. In 1949, Frank and Lottie retire finally. And we get a couple, the Pettys, and they're only here for 3 years or so. He ends up running for county commissioner. They did bring a nurse in to try to help with things a little bit more, but then they hire Mildred and Jean Rowe in 1952, and they end up running the institution until 1969. And then there's Doris Roof, and she was just a nurse, and that was it. There was no superintendent and matron anymore, because I think they were waiting for the transition. So around 1967, there starts to be a plea to pass a levy to build a nursing home on former county homeland, because in the 50s they stopped farming, and it fails a bunch of times, which is interesting, because in the 1867, when they were going to build the county home, they did not want to build it in Bowling Green because they did not want the riffraff of Perrysburg ruining this town. So, and it took a while for them to be able to pass the levy to build the building, and it was the same for here. And they were showing, you know, the bathrooms were not adequate. There were too many stairs for the elderly to get up and down. But then it finally does pass, and in 1971, this building closes, and they build Woodhaven and move everybody.
So then how did the infirmary go on to become the Wood County Museum?
This building sat empty for a few years, and I was told that they did want to tear it down, but the county commissioners did not have the money to do so, because I think, I could be wrong, but I think I was told it's like around $11,000 in 1971, 72 to tear it down, and they did not have the money to do so. And so initially this becomes part of the Park District, and they called it the Adams Phillips Park. And initially the Park District managed both the site and the buildings, but they decided the buildings were too much, and so they turned it over to the Historical Society, and they had a caretaker. I think the Haggerty family lived in here for a while to keep the vandals out. And obviously it took a long time because there was no heat in the center and east wings, and the building was falling apart. And it was Alvy Perkins who helped us get the tax appropriation money through property tax to help manage the site itself. So it would have been, I think, September 12th, 1975 is when they dedicated the building to become the museum. And actually Charles Kerfuss, who was our representative, he gave the speech that dedicated the site. And we have grown by leaps and bounds, especially in the 12 years that I have been here.
Today, Kirkendall and her colleagues at the Wood County Museum are dedicated to bringing the history of the Wood County Infirmary back to life and to telling stories that humanize the infirmary residents and correct misconceptions about the nature of rural poverty in America in the 19th and 20th centuries.
My number one goal as curator is to make sure that we are extremely respectful of the people who lived in this building, because everyone has fallen on hard times. And again, poverty is circumstantial. It's not because people want to be poor. You have to understand the reasons why poverty exists.
The museum's flagship initiative among these efforts to date is the award-winning exhibit For Comfort and Convenience, Public Charity in Ohio by Way of the Poor Farm, curated by Kirkendall and featuring the work of photographer Jeffrey Hall. This exhibit also served as the basis for Kirkendall's book, Ohio's Infirmary Buildings, published in 2023 by the History Press.
For Comfort and Convenience, it's our story of the entire poorhouse community within the state of Ohio. Because when I started as curator in 2012, there was not necessarily a good overview of what our building was used for. A lot of misconceptions. And I met the photographer Jeffrey Hall, and we started talking about, you really think we could do this? You think that you could travel the state? And he's always up for an adventure. So I wrote a grant to the Ohio Arts Council, and they don't always get museums, like our museum, writing grants to them. They thought it was a great idea. So I got that grant. And I also wrote a grant to the Ohio Humanities Council, which was the full award, the full $20,000 grant. We had a lot of support. And, Jeff's photos are beautiful, and we spent all this time looking through what we wanted to show, and then all of the research, me going to Columbus and to the Hayes and reading all the annual reports and just contacting every single county and talking to libraries and universities and genealogies and local history museums and individual private citizens to gather up all of that information. I think it's great because it can, again, talking about poverty, which is not something that's talked about, and it really connects Wood County to the rest of the state, right? To the average person, and they feel connected to that. So, and it's a stepping stone. And my next step, obviously, our small exhibit showing the people who had physical and mental disabilities living in our building. We're going to start telling the stories of the people. We have over 7,000 applications for relief. We have all of our, intake ledger books. We have the accounting books. We can put together what's going on. I have researched people for a decade. My colleague Millie Broca, Wood County Genealogy, has been sending me information for over a decade. We have a lot of stories to tell, and I think that's the next step. That's the next thing that we are going to do, and I think that will be well received. And I know that, professionally, we are doing something very unique that is becoming well known in the state. So I'm really proud of that.
Over the last several years, Kirkendall and colleagues have also conducted extensive research to identify the residents who were buried at the infirmary cemetery that is now part of the Wood County Museum grounds. These efforts culminated in a monument at the site of the cemetery that restores the names of those who are interred there.
It was important to me, and like I said, my colleague Millie Broca, that we really identified the people in our cemetery, because part of the Ohio State Board of Charities recommendation was that you needed to have a cemetery within a mile of your institution for people who could not afford burial. And because our stones are numbered and not named, there's, misconception again. We don't know who's out there. Their lives were terrible, and that is not true. And so we looked at 4 different sources to confirm who is out there. Now, there is no map. There is no list. Luckily, and again, this is a testament to both Edwin Farmer and Frank Brandeberry, they wrote down who died, when they died. They would put obits in the paper, well-written obits about these people's lives.
The Daily Sentinel Tribune, March 20th, 1909. Sarah Legrand, aged 88, one of the characters at the infirmary, died there this morning after suffering for some time with paralysis. Sally was taken to the infirmary from Bloom Township in 1901 and had been a resident of the institution ever since. She was a native of Pennsylvania, and so far as known, she is survived by one relative, a son, Henry, whose whereabouts are unknown. Interment will be Sunday. Sally, as she was called, was an inveterate smoker using the strongest plug tobacco for her pipe. She appeared to have a fireproof throat, as she could lift a coffee pot off the stove and drink down the liquid red hot without the slightest injury or inconvenience. The Daily Sentinel-Tribune, February 23, 1920. Hiram Phoenix, aged 84 years, died of influenza Sunday evening at 8 p.m. He had been ill for about a week. Funeral services will be held Tuesday afternoon at 12 p.m. at the home, Reverend Orwig being in charge. Mr. Phoenix became an inmate of the home last January, but prior to that time, he had at various times for many years been an inmate. He leaves no known relatives. He was born near Weston, where he was well known. He was familiarly known as High Phoenix, the fortune teller. He was a very likable man and had many friends.
And after 1908, we have death certificates. And so we're able to figure these things out. And so we went through everything that we had, all the information that had been compiled for years and years and years, and Millie had gone through newspapers, and we made a list, and we put a monument out in our cemetery. Since we put that monument out, we found 12 more people, and we keep finding them. So we added them to the interpretive panel that is out there. I do get research requests, and actually, I think I've discovered another person who we did not have out there. So again, we are humanizing the people who lived in this building and trying to get away from the popular culture idea that all institutional living is bad. And so I'm really proud of the cemetery monument. We've actually had people come out and they have brought their priest and done blessings. We've had people come out to pray over who they, with their relatives. And so it's very comforting for the community to know that their relative was treated well. Because that's the thing, if people call me, or they'll email me and they'll say, I think my relative's out there and we don't know anything about them. And I can do all the research and give the reason why they were here and then make sure to tell them, well, they lived here when Edwin Farmer was in charge, and I can assure you their life was not terrible, that they probably were treated with a great deal of respect. And that is so comforting. Families absolutely love that and the information, because they wouldn't get it otherwise. They wouldn't know where to start because most people don't know that we have our records.
Why does the history of the Wood County Infirmary remain important for us to remember today?
Poverty history is not taught in school, and I think the vast majority of people are able to identify more with poverty than they are with extreme wealth. I think that there's a feeling of comfort when there are recognizable items when you go through a museum, right? Things that you've seen at grandma's house, or perhaps you used when you were a child, or hearing stories about going to the poorhouse, because my grandma was a lot older than everybody else's grandma, and a generation older than most grandmas. And so I heard about going to the poorhouse when I was a kid. And when I was doing research for our exhibit, I got to the point where I was asking for the oldest person, because younger people weren't knowing what I was talking about when I said information on the poorhouse. It's a whole segment of the population that would be, their stories, it would be like they cease to exist if we did not tell who they are, because history tends to remember the wealthy businessman or his wife or the people who built things, but not the people, maybe the builders, or not the people who had to struggle to make a living. That is something that we don't tend to think about saving, right? And this is our field. We want to save those things. People, I'm sure they call you too, and they're like, well, I don't think anybody wants this. Like, no, we do, because there would be absolutely no record that you ever existed if we didn't have those types of things. And this is why it's so important that the Wood County Museum still exists, because we are one of very few that can tell a story of poverty. Poverty history, it just does not exist. And we have a 50-acre site that is going to explain what happened if you could not pay your bills or you didn't have a place to live in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I think that, to me, is what I like so much. And then, just on a personal note, I used to work with the Sisters of Mercy at Mercy College, and I was born at Mercy Hospital. learning about Catherine Macaulay and the poor, I think it's a humbling thing. And that's the power of women, too. And I think it's just so fulfilling to know that if I'm not the person taking care of them, at least I'm taking care of their memory. So I think it's just a neat thing. And then I'm learning so much about the people who lived in Wood County.
Nearly all the buildings and facilities from the days of the Wood County Infirmary still stand today at the Wood County Museum. And as you traverse the museum grounds, you can easily begin to feel as if the distance between the past and the present has collapsed. And you're standing on this ground as it was well over a century ago, before the Wood County Museum, before County Home Road, before busy highways bifurcated the surrounding land, when this site was part of a 200-acre communal farm, and home to those in Wood County who had been left behind by a rapidly modernizing and industrializing world, and were left with nowhere else to turn. The rural poor, elderly, sick, and disabled, who are so often rendered invisible in American history. Thanks to Wood County Museum Curator Holly Kirkendall, our guest for this episode of Storied Ground. Thanks also to the Wood County Museum for allowing us to feature items from their historical archives, especially the transcript of Leonora Smith Fryer's oral history interview. Our voice actors for this episode were Samantha Heater and Dylan Sickles. I'm your host and producer, Nick Pavlik. Our executive producer is Chris Pfeiffer. If you have any questions, comments, or you want to listen again, go to wgte.org/ground or wherever you stream your podcasts.
WGTE. Voices around us.
WGTE is supported in part by the American Rescue Plan Act funds allocated by the City of Toledo and the Lucas County Commissioners and administered by the Arts Commission.